Hey everyone, if you missed my community post here on YouTube or my post on my Instagram feed a few weeks ago, then you might not know that my dad passed away at the end of May. And I'm not okay. I'm really not okay. I was not ready. It was very fast. I've lost loved ones before. I have lost several family members in the last year and a half, and it hurts like hell every single time. But this is the most pain I have ever felt in my life, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. But the thing that sucks the most about it is that almost everyone will feel this pain at some point in their life. If there is any experience that is universal, it is experiencing the loss of someone you love. And I've talked about this before in videos, especially last year around the time my uncle died, that I was reading some books at the time that had themes of grief for characters who were grieving, and that as hard as that was to read at the time, it was also cathartic and healing. And I have found that to be true through my entire life. Every loss I've had, I have found solace in books. And for me, that isn't nonfiction books specifically about coping with grief, although I have ordered some to read in the wake of losing my father, because I'll try anything at this point. But mostly fiction is what I have found really helpful to feel less alone, to feel, like I said, that catharsis, to experience someone else's grief and to allow that to fill me, and to feel the empathy for the character and their loss, and to experience their grieving through them, and to be able to let out some of that pent-up pain, to be reminded that this is a universal experience, as painful as it is, to feel less alone, to feel seen, to feel like I am in community. So in the wake of losing my dad, I have been thinking about the books I have read in the past that have helped me through grief, and considering revisiting them, rereading them, and trying to find that comfort. But I've also been starting to compile a list of books I haven't read yet that explore grief in some capacity. Just build a little bit of a TBR for myself to slowly work my way through, try to find some meaning or comfort in all of this. And as I was compiling that list, I started thinking that I really should be sharing this. I guess I just hope that this could help someone, maybe. And as always, I will have book cards for each of these with content warnings. Please read the content warnings, especially if you are freshly grieving, if you are really in your grief right now. I do not want you to pick up a book on my recommendation thinking it will help you through your grief and for it to traumatize you or set you back or damage your mental health even further. And there is a risk of that with any book when you're in a vulnerable position, and when it's a book that explores things that you are currently wrestling with that are traumatic. So please be gentle with yourself, be kind with yourself, read the content warnings, and also as you start to read a book, please check in with yourself and make sure you're still okay and you're handling it okay. I'm not giving you medical or mental health advice. I am just sharing books that have helped me through grief. Basically what I'm saying is just please take care of yourself, please. Like I said, these are all fictional. They're also in a variety of genres. I do tend to read pretty widely. I have choices from classic literature to historical fiction to horror, fantasy, sci-fi, literary fiction, contemporary fiction. So hopefully I cover a lot of those bases and something here will appeal to you. Oh, also one final note. Because I do want to disclose the kind of loss that is being explored in each book, I think what I'll do is add that information underneath the content warnings, which should be my left, but your right on the screen when the book card pops up with the green background. So if you don't want to see the content warnings or the kind of loss being explored in the novel, if those are spoilers for you, you can just not pay attention to the book cards when they're on the screen for the few seconds they're on the screen, or only focus on your left or my right, which is the more general information like the genre and the age demographic and the cover, and ignore this side, which will be content warnings and the type of loss being explored. So that way, whether you view that as a spoiler or not, hopefully this video can kind of accommodate everyone. Okay, I've been talking long enough for an introduction, so let's get into it. I want to start with the books that I read in childhood. These are books that helped me through my first few losses as a child and as a preteen, especially the loss of my grandmother, who I was very close to. So the first book I wanted to talk about was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. This is a classic. It is the story of 4 sisters in the mid-19th century in New England in the US, and their father is off fighting. They're living with their mother, and we are mostly following Jo, who is one of the 4 sisters, the second oldest sister, and experiencing her family and the dynamics in their family, especially the sibling dynamics between the 4 sisters, and different versions of, different expressions of womanhood and girlhood. And I have always felt very attached to this book. I've always felt very seen by this book as a sister with a sister. I have seen myself in all of the sisters to varying degrees, but especially always loved and felt some sort of a kinship to Beth and Amy. And there is a loss in this book, which you've probably had spoiled for you, even if you haven't read this or watched an adaptation, especially if you've ever seen Friends, but I will not spoil it for you here. But when I first experienced the loss, it wrecked me. And I felt like I was grieving someone that I knew who was, in my own family. And that was really an eye-opening experience as a child, but it also prepared me in some ways to handle the losses that would come later in my childhood. And while I wouldn't say that grief is the primary theme here or the primary idea being explored, I do think it's mostly about family and family bonds and those relationships, and also what it means to be a woman and independence as a woman, the ability to choose the life you want and what that means and what that looks like. I will say that something that I love about this book and how it explores grief is that it does such a great job of depicting the emptiness, depicting the loneliness, depicting the black hole left behind when you lose someone, that space that they filled in your life and in your heart and in your home suddenly being empty, and how bereft that leaves you feeling, how strange and wrong that can feel, how devastating that is for that space that they occupied to be empty. So I feel like that's something that this book does really well, and also the ways that a loss, as painful as it can be, can bring those who loved that person closer together, that you can knit over and heal those wounds and end up stronger because of it, and to have a stronger bond with the people you love if you support each other through a loss like that. So anyway, I won't talk too long about this because I imagine many of you are already familiar, but I have found that this has helped me a lot through grief in my life in many different ways, and it has made me feel very seen for that feeling, that emptiness, and how painful that is. The other one that I read many, many times as a child that also has a loss, and again, this loss is not the main purpose of the book. It's not the primary theme of the book. This is another one where the loss hit me so hard when I read it for the first time as a child. Again, feeling like I was losing someone in my own life, someone that I knew personally and who was important to me, and just devastating. And this one is one that I am a bit scared to reread, honestly, now, because I think it's really going to hit me in a whole new way. But I also love this book and imagine that it will be very cathartic to read. So the book I'm talking about is Anne of Green Gables by Ella Montgomery. Again, one that you've probably heard of, if not read or seen some sort of an adaptation of. Again, this is not a book that is specifically about grief or entirely about grief. Grief is just one piece of the puzzle. But in this book, we follow Anne, who is an orphan. That is established before the novel starts, and that loss does come up from time to time, but really it's another loss that happens over the course of the book that is the grief that I am mostly talking about, and the one that really impacted me as a child. And again, every time I've reread this, including the most recent reread, and there are just some really beautiful moments, some beautiful quotes in this book about the loss of the character, both from Anne's perspective, but also from some of the other characters who were close to the person who passed. And especially my most recent reread, I just felt so moved by those moments of grieving, and again, grieving together, finding a new closeness and support for each other through that pain. This is a book that was meant for children and has a child as a protagonist, but is definitely still completely readable for adults. It's set in the late 19th century in Prince Edward Island in Canada, and there are other messages in the book. I think the book primarily is about a coming of age story and sort of carving your own path and embracing who you are and letting that shine and not letting other people sort of force you to conform or to dull who you are, and also a sense of family and belonging. And it's a beautiful book. It's one of my favorites. Like I said, I've reread it many, many, many times, but the loss in this book has always been incredibly impactful for me. And again, it's just one of those books that I think helped me confront the idea of grief and loss before it had really impacted me personally, and in some ways prepared me to tackle that and to cope with loss when it would come. And I have found it very comforting and, like I said, quite cathartic and healing to reread in years since. And again, hopefully I will find that to be true next time I reread as well. And quickly before I go on, in the same series, Anne of Green Gables is book 1 in a series, and book 8, the final book in the series, is Rilla of Ingleside. This focuses on Rilla, who is Anne's youngest daughter, and she is the protagonist. This is her perspective, and she's, I think, 15 or 16 when the book starts, and it takes place during World War I, and the loss of a family member who is fighting in the war. Rereading this more recently as an adult, I was completely bowled over by it. I was very emotional about the loss and the way it explored that grief. And in this book, again, I would say that primarily it is a coming of age story. It's about Rilla going from a child to a woman through this really turbulent time. But the loss is very foundational and transformative for her. It's such a huge piece of how she sort of rearranges who she is into this adult version of herself as she grows and heals from that loss. And it's really beautifully and emotionally and heartbreakingly written. I almost forgot another childhood favorite that I think is very relevant here that I will quickly mention. If you are a fan of prehistoric fiction, I feel like that's probably a very small niche, but if you have never heard of the Clan of the Cave Bear series, it was a very popular series in, the 80s and the 90s, and I read it at much too young of an age, but book 1 and book 2 specifically were my favorites, and I reread them many, 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 many times, and have reread them many times since. And book 1 has its own form of grief because the protagonist essentially is left orphaned and alone because of a natural disaster, and that's how she ends up in the situation that kicks off the book and how she ends up with the people that she ends up with. And a lot of the first book is her sort of finding a new family and finding a new sense of belonging after that loss. But she's also very young when she loses her community and her family, and she doesn't remember it very vividly. So I would say book 1 is not as much focused on grief, but book 2, without giving too many spoilers, I will really try not to spoil it, but book 2 is so much more about grief and about the protagonist's experience of grief, the loneliness, that bereft, empty hole left behind, and we really experience her grieving through so much of the novel and feeling that pain and the loss. And it's definitely very visceral and hard to read at times, and it makes me emotional every time I read it. But I have always found it to be very cathartic, and I've also found that the way that she processes and moves forward from her grief, the way she tries to hold on to the memories of those she lost and honor them and keep them alive in her memory, but also the way that she builds a new family and connects and finds a new sense of belonging and love after such a profound loss. I've always found it very inspiring. So lots of people critique this series and find it a bit silly. I will say that there is a romance subplot that comes in the second half of this book that is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. It's not really my cup of tea either, but not only does our protagonist of the entire series deal with a lot of grief, especially in this second book, but also there is another character who is introduced in this book, and they also experience their own loss and grief, and it's a different kind of loss from what the protagonist is feeling, and they're both very fresh in that loss and the grieving process. And again, very visceral, emotional, cathartic to read. It makes me sob every time I read it for both of them and both of their losses multiple times. But there is something very inspiring and hopeful about the way they move forward with it without feeling like they're forgetting the people they've lost. So anyway, this might not be your cup of tea, but if you are at all interested in the idea of prehistoric fiction, you might find reading book 1 and book 2 for their different explorations of grief might be something that is meaningful for you. I wouldn't recommend continuing in the series for the general public. I think some people might enjoy reading on in the series. I personally tend to stop my rereads after book 2 or 3 every time and not continue on to book 6. But your mileage may vary. Many of the other books in the series also have grief and loss in one way or another. But for me, book 1, both sort of the setup of book 1, but also losses that happen later in the book are very impactful to me and have always really resonated with me. But then again, the second book is just so much about that grief and the loss, and I've always found it very comforting, as sad as it is. So that's another potential option from my childhood favorites. So moving on to books that I read for the first time more recently in the last 5 years or so, I'm going to roughly split them up by genre just to make it easier to find what you might be looking for. So starting with contemporary and or historical fiction, starting with one of the books on this list that is the most specifically and overtly about grief and loss, which is The Collected Regrets of Clover by Mickey Brommer. I was sent this book from the publisher to read. I hoped to like it, but I did not expect to be so emotionally destroyed over it. This book is specifically and explicitly about grief, about exploring grief. That is the whole point of this book. Both our protagonist, who loses someone very close to them and is struggling through how to move forward without that person, but also because our protagonist is a death doula as a career. And so she is dealing with other people's loss and grief every day for her job, in addition to now having this personal grief that has really blown up her life in a way that she didn't expect. She thought she would be more prepared to handle a loss and was kind of shocked by how destroyed she was. I just found this really beautiful. I know it's very specifically looking at grief. It explores it from many different angles. And there were just so many quotes in this book that feel incredibly relevant to me, that felt very moving, that helped me to think about grief in a different way. I actually quoted this book, or badly paraphrased it, to my mom about 2 days after my dad's passing. And it made me want to reread the book, but also made her want to read it. So I felt this was really beautifully done. I really connected to it. I really felt its handling of grief was very empathetic and thoughtful, like I said, and I found it quite emotional and cathartic. I did cry a lot reading it, but I also, like I said, feel like it helped me sort of rearrange some of my thoughts on grief and be able to articulate some of the ways that I conceptualize grief and loss in a new way that I found very helpful. So I would highly recommend this one. Just keep in mind, like I said, this book is very specifically about grief and loss, and the whole book is centered around that. So if you are very fresh in your grief, this might be very difficult to read. I probably won't be able to revisit this one for a little while, but I do plan on rereading it eventually. For another contemporary pick, I have The Reading List by Sarah Nisha Adams. This was a book club pick for my book club over on Patreon maybe a year and a half ago, something like that. This one is also pretty explicitly about grief. One of our protagonists is right in those fresh stages of loss when the book starts, and they are kind of, ironically considering what this video is, they are trying to cope with or process their grief by reading some of the books that their loved one read shortly before they died, trying to hold on to pieces of their loved one through reading the same books that they read. There are two points of view and two main protagonists in this book, and one of them is already grieving at the start, and the other one experiences their own form of grief over the course of the novel, which I won't give details here for spoiler reasons, but this really is a book about grief and healing and community, relying on your community to heal from grief, but also the power of literature to heal us. And again, just very relevant to this video. Every time I talk about this book, I feel like I have to mention this, that I thought this was going to be book club bait and just kind of faux emotional or faux deep, but I found this really wholesome and heartwarming and emotional and sincere, and I loved it. Honestly, I'm really looking forward to rereading this one soon. It was just, a lot more moving and heartfelt and honest and raw than I expected it to be going into it. So I would recommend this one as well, like all of these books on this list, for another contemporary option and for two different types of grief. Honestly, you could almost even say three types of grief in a single book. Something that has a very hopeful tone to it, which honestly, all the books I've talked about so far, I would say end on a very hopeful note, which I think is good when you're going through grief. To finish off this section, I have two books that are kind of contemporary, kind of historical fiction, depending on how you define it. The first one is Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson, and this one is historical fiction in that it takes place in the 90s, which are now a while ago, but that depends on your definition of historical fiction. Maybe for you that still counts as contemporary fiction. This one does have little sprinklings of the supernatural, sort of a magical realism kind of essence to it, but I definitely wouldn't classify it as fantasy, for example. It's pretty solidly contemporary or historical fiction, depending on how you would define it. And this book is very much about loss and processing of grief, and sort of processing of grief as a journey and anticipatory grief. Our protagonist has a loved one go missing and doesn't know what's happened to them and seeks out to try to find them. So they're on a literal journey, but also on this sort of emotional internal journey of, like I said, sort of an anticipatory grief for this loved one. And I found this really beautiful, very moving. It's specifically about the Haisla people in British Columbia in Canada, written by an Indigenous Canadian author. It is, like I said, very beautifully written. The setting is incredibly vivid. You really feel like you're there. The setting is such an important piece of the puzzle for this story and really ties in with some of the main characters' core memories with their loved one. There are some other sort of peripheral losses that are also explored through this journey, as you might have found in your own experiences of grief. And I certainly have found that every time you are faced with grief again, at least for me, it brings back past griefs. It reminds me of my other griefs, even the ones that are decades old and mostly healed. And this book kind of explores that idea as well. It's just such a gorgeously written book. It's very moving and maybe has a little bit more of a literary fiction, hazy, dreamlike quality to it, which kind of ties into that magical realism or that slight sprinkling of the supernatural. But I would really recommend this one. It's just such a beautiful book in general, but also specifically for the way it explores grief. The last one on this list, like I said, sort of a mix of contemporary and historical fiction, is The Yield by Tara June Lynch, who is an Aboriginal author from Australia. And this has dual timelines. So there's a contemporary timeline, there's also a historical timeline, and also is dealing with loss. Our contemporary protagonist has lost someone and has traveled back home to go through their things, and they come across some written work from the family member they lost, and we get to experience what's happening in the letters in that historical timeline. This is another one that's just such a beautiful book. It's so beautifully written, very emotional, a lot of catharsis, a lot of crying in reading it. But there's also a larger exploration of loss through colonization, assimilation, that cultural loss, and the cultural genocide of Indigenous, or in this case, Aboriginal cultures. That mirrors the personal, familial loss in a really heartbreaking but also beautiful way. Next, I'm going to move on to sci-fi. I have a couple sci-fi options. I'll start with the most loosely sci-fi book of the three. This one, many people might consider to be closer to a contemporary. It's very near future. It's sort of a post-climate collapse, societal collapse, sort of dystopian leaning world. Definitely much more grounded in reality and very, very near future, but not an actual literal representation of our current time. So I've loosely categorized it as sci-fi in the past, so that's why I'm putting it here, but it sort of bridges the gap, and you might consider it close enough to contemporary fiction to count for that. But anyway, this is I Cheerfully Refuse by Leif Enger, and this one, also kind of similar to Monkey Beach, I suppose, has a bit of a literal journey that mirrors the emotional journey of grief. Our protagonist is traveling by boat on the Great Lakes, both to escape a dangerous situation, but also in search of something that was important to the person they've lost. Again, similar to Monkey Beach, that physical journey, also by boat in proximity to Canada, which is interesting. I found this deeply moving. This was one of my favorite reads of last year. Just completely blew me away. Much of this book is the protagonist processing their grief. We experience the loss with them and then watch them through many of those early stages of the denial and the anger and despair and slowly coming to terms with what their life is going to be without that person, and trying to keep their memory alive, trying to do things that would make that person proud. And it's heartbreaking. And there are other aspects of the book that are also very difficult to read. Another one that just felt very hopeful to me. And there was this sense that everyone was going to be okay. And sometimes you just need that reminder when you're going through it. So I would highly recommend this book. I just think it's so beautifully written. It is very emotional. And another one, just really all of these, I guess, they're very emotionally honest and sincere, heartfelt and vulnerable and raw, and that's something I really value in the exploration of something like grief. For some more sci-fi, I do have another second book in a series, so I apologize, but it is a really fantastic series, so I would recommend reading book one so that you can also read book two. But specifically, the second book of the Locked Tomb series, which is Harrow the Ninth, very much has to do with grief, even in ways that you might not pick up on until much later in the book. It does have a bit of an experimental writing style. It's very dreamlike and confusing and strange until you sort of put the pieces together later on in the book. And part of the reason for that choice in the writing is because of this grief that is being experienced. And I just found it a really beautiful, kind of overall as an entire book, a metaphor for grief. You know, the many ways that we try to avoid dealing with it instead of allowing ourselves to feel that pain because it just hurts so much. And it's a beautiful book. I really, really loved it. It's very different in tone and content and writing style to book one in the series, which is Gideon the Ninth, but I also loved the first book in the series for its own reasons. And I would highly recommend this series in general. I also really loved the third book in the series, Nona the Ninth, which also has its own sort of interactions with or explorations of grief. And book one also explores grief a little bit, but again, it's much more of a secondary or tertiary theme or element of the story. Harrow the Ninth is very much, to me, just in its entirety, a metaphor for unhealthy coping mechanisms for grief, essentially. The series is kind of a blend of science fiction and fantasy. It does have magic, but it also has advanced technology and takes place far in the future. It has spaceships and going to different planets. I tend to label it as sci-fi in my own mind, but it is kind of a blend and it's speculative fiction. Another sci-fi recommendation is also book two in a series, but it is a duology, so there's only two, and both book one and book two were fantastic. I gave them both 5 stars. They're both really worth the read. If you're a fan of harder sci-fi, I would recommend this. But The House of Saints, which is book two in the Venus Ascendant duology. Book one is The House of Sticks by Derek Kungskin, and book one also has its own grief sort of woven through the story. But book 2, again, just really focuses on grief in a much more prominent way. I just really was very moved by the way that this book talked about grief. It made me cry so many times. There was one particular chapter that I was sobbing through, and as soon as I finished it, I interrupted my husband from what he was doing and read a bunch of quotes to him, because it just so perfectly expressed how grief feels to me, and just really echoed conversations we had really recently had about grief and loss after the loss of my sister's mother-in-law earlier this year, who is an incredible and lovely woman. We were talking about and processing that grief, and so many of the things we said were echoed in this book and just so beautifully stated. This world is a very dangerous one. Basically, we are following a family that live in a colony on Venus, but instead of on the surface of Venus, because it's impossible to survive there, they live in ships that are floating in the atmosphere of Venus. Even though they are up above the surface, the atmosphere of Venus is also toxic. It's full of sulfuric acid. There is a lot of loss just by nature of living in the atmosphere of such a volatile planet that is inhospitable to human life. And so these characters have lost a lot of people in the past, and they continue to lose people. It is very common for people to die at the hands of Venus. And so much of this series, but really especially the second book, is about how they process that loss and grief, and also about the ways that their belief system and their superstitions and their understanding of Venus as their home is impacted by how dangerous it is and how tied it is with their loss and grief and pain. Really, really beautiful. So stunningly written. Probably the most beautifully written hard sci-fi I've ever read. Highly recommend this duology. It's not talked about enough. It's really gorgeous. Really so perfectly captured so many of my own thoughts and feelings about grief in a way that felt like when you talk to someone and they just immediately express what you couldn't put to words, and you just feel so seen and understood and cared for in that moment and not alone. That's how this book made me feel. So also feel that maybe the second book in Becky Chambers' Wayfarer series, which is A Closed and Common Orbit. Don't quote me on that. It has been years since I read the series, and I really am due for a reread. So whenever I do get around to rereading the series, I will add a note somewhere in the description box or in the pinned comment or something with which book it actually is that I'm thinking of that has more of a grief focus. I feel like it's either book 2 or book 4, but I can't quite remember. The 4 books have sort of blended together in my mind. And then also I would say Becky Chambers' novella To Be Taught If Fortunate, very short, and again, maybe not as explicitly about loss or grief, but there is sort of a melancholic, reflective, emotional tone to this story. But there is sort of a recurring motif of loss, and maybe loss on a larger scale, and survival that is maybe more tangentially related to grief. But I've reread this a couple times and I just find it so deeply moving and incredibly beautiful, and it's very short. Would highly recommend it. I will say that there is a character who experiences suicidal ideation at one point. So if that is something that you are facing in the wake of grief, perhaps this is not the book to read right now. Please, again, take care of yourself, please. But if that is not something you are currently facing in your grief journey, you might find this to be a very beautiful exploration of sort of loss on a different scale. Moving on to fantasy, I think I only have 2 books that are fantasy that I'm going to talk about here. The first one is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. This whole trilogy, the Broken Earth trilogy, touches quite a bit on grief and loss. This first book is pretty visceral and raw and heartbreaking. Please look at the content warnings for this one before diving in. Especially take note of the content warnings surrounding children. This has some really dark, some very difficult content in it, but I will say that I just found it so well done, so moving, really vivid characters. It is another one that is sort of a physical, geographical journey that mirrors the internal journey. And in general, this series is just one of the most beautifully written, masterful works of genius that I have ever read of really any genre. I will recommend this trilogy forever and a day, but especially this first book really does feel so deeply entrenched in the protagonist's grief. And that is such a ever-present cloak that she wears. So anyway, highly recommend the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin. Some people will say this is the second in a series. It's a prequel though, and you definitely could read it without reading the other book in this series, but this is A Day of Fallen Night by Samantha Shannon. This one is huge. Epic high fantasy. Not every character in this book is processing grief. There are several different protagonists, but my personal favorite protagonist in this book has had a loss, and that grief is a much older grief. It's a grief from decades before, I think over 20 years before, or close to 20 years. And so unlike many of these books where the grief, even if it did happen before the start of the book, it was much more fresh for many of these. In this case, the grief that's being explored is a much older grief that, as much as it has healed over in some ways, it has, healed into a new shape, and it's still tender. And this is another one where I feel like there's as sad as it is, as heartbreaking as it is, there is something very hopeful and heartwarming about the way it's handled. This is one that I feel like I have a bit of a fuzzier memory of for the details, because I was in the middle of reading this when my uncle passed last year. And again, going through, a brain full of holes, brain fog sort of time. But I found it very comforting and cathartic for me as I was dealing with that fresh grief. And from what I can recall, I do believe other characters have their own experiences of grief and process them in different ways, but there is one particular character and her specific grief that feels the most prominent in my memory, and it was the most touching to me. Again, this one, it's pretty huge. I wouldn't recommend it if you're not a fan of epic or high fantasy, and it has many different protagonists, and grief, again, is not maybe the absolute most prominent theme in the entire book. There are many different themes being explored, but grief does come up sort of again and again in different ways. And I found the way that Samantha Shannon wrote about grief in this book to be incredibly moving and touching, and really helped me with that initial stage of sort of the shock period. Maybe an option if you are a fan of epic fantasy, high fantasy, and like I said, this is technically the second book written after Priory of the Orange Tree, but it's a prequel, so you could read it as a standalone, though I also do love Priory of the Orange Tree. My last category here is horror, which might seem weird to highlight horror books that explore grief, but I have found, especially in the realm of literary horror, a lot of literary horror is exploring the very visceral aspects of loss and grief in a way that I have personally found very moving and healing, in a way that I never would have expected until I started getting more into the genre of literary horror. But if you're not a horror reader and you're not willing to give it a try, even literary horror that is not necessarily super graphic or scary, then you can skip this section using the chapters and see my TBR of books that I'm going to be checking out. But for those of you who are already on the horror train or are willing to give it a try, these are some of my absolute favorite books of the last couple years, and so it's really hard to even figure out where to start. Maybe I'll start with some of the ones that I like a lot but are not my absolute top favorite, and I'll kind of work my way to some of my absolute favorites. Rouge by Mona Awad. This book is about many different things, and grief is quite a prominent piece of it, but it is also balanced by quite a bit of commentary on the beauty industry, skincare industry, and the predatory nature of that, harmful European beauty standards. All of those themes are also sort of intertwined and tied with our protagonist's complicated relationship with the person who she has lost and who she's grieving. So as much as grief is, I would say, pretty prominent in this story, and there is sort of an arc throughout of the protagonist processing the loss of this person, it's not solely about grief. There are other themes and ideas being explored. This one is kind of a mix of sci-fi and horror, but a really fantastic book, and I would highly recommend it. I'm a big fan of Mona Awad's writing, and this one felt very personal and emotional, especially in that familial relationship between the protagonist and their loved one who they lost. They had a very complicated relationship, and that added more layers of complexity to the protagonist's grief. In a similar vein, a book that is sort of equally about grief and loss, and also beauty standards and the skincare or health wellness industry that is a mix of sci-fi and horror. And one of my favorite books of the last couple of years is Natural Beauty by Ling Huang. I'll also say Ling Huang's most recent release, Immaculate Conception, also touches on grief, but I would say this book, Natural Beauty, is maybe more prominently exploring the idea of grief. And similarly to Rouge, I would say not every moment, not every aspect of this book is focused on the grief itself, but the grief is ever present underneath maybe the more flashy plot of the sci-fi and the horror and the exploration of the beauty, healthcare, wellness industries, harmful European beauty standards. Again, this book also looks at some of the complicated dynamics of being the child of immigrants, and also has some really gorgeous writing about being a musician and about the healing impact of music on a person and on relationships that I found very relatable as someone who grew up with music. Her parents taught her to play piano. She shared her love of music with her parents. And I grew up playing piano. Music has always been a huge part of my life. And my dad was a huge music lover. And that was something we always shared and really connected on. So that's sort of another layer for me, I guess, here, which when I read this, I still had my dad. So that wasn't a piece that I was as focused on, but will definitely hit me hard, I imagine, when I reread this. But the science fiction and the horror aspect, kind of like with Rouge, sort of mirrors in an external way and in an exaggerated, almost satirical way, the internal transformation that's happening because of the grief that the protagonist is experiencing. And this also has a little bit of anticipatory grief. One of my favorite books of the last couple of years, really fantastic, highly recommend. Another one of my absolute favorite books of the last couple of years, I think this was my top favorite book of 2023, if I'm remembering correctly, Monstrilio by Gerardo Samano Cordova. This is a gorgeous book. It's so beautifully written and really kicks off because of this intense grief that a character is feeling, and that unwillingness to let go, inability to let go, deep despair, the desolation leads to the horror element of the story. And it's such a beautiful book. It is so much exploring these very complicated family dynamics and what it means to be a person and what makes a monster, and looking at the ways that grief can transform us. And again, the horror element is how I view it, is essentially a metaphor for the ways that grief can transform us and can sort of rot us from the inside out if we let it and if we don't try to process and heal from it. Also has some other themes, also explores some other things, but I would say this book is very prominently a metaphor for grief and loss and looking at this complex family dynamic and the repercussions of the choices that they made, and just very beautifully written, very emotional, very vulnerable and raw and poetic, and another one that was very cathartic for me. The last book I wanted to talk about here is yet another literary horror where the entirety of the horror element feels to me like a metaphor for grief, and that is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is another one of my favorite books of the last couple years. So poetic and hazy and dreamlike and strange. Very reflective, I would say, of the early period of grief that I am right in the middle of myself. That is just, you feel like you're in a haze, you feel like you're in a dream, you feel like you could wake up at any moment and they would be with you and okay. Often you're having literal dreams about them where they are still alive, either sleeping too much or sleeping too little, maybe not eating very much, and just sort of your brain fog and feeling lost. And this book to me is just a stunningly heartfelt and devastating metaphor for that stage of grief. And in the book itself, in the narrative of the book, taken more literally, we are watching someone lose someone they love and feeling that grief. But there are more layers to how you can interpret what's happening in the novel, and different people are going to interpret it differently. But I just think this is one of the most beautifully written books I've read in the last couple years. It touched me very deeply. I found it incredibly emotional, very visceral, and it's definitely one I'm going to be rereading, but I can already tell, thinking about it and thinking about the way that the horror elements go in this book and the body horror aspect, and the way that that feels like a metaphor for terminal illness or the physical deterioration of someone you love, which is something that I was witness to with my dad. I'm gonna need time, I think, before I can reread this one, but I definitely will be rereading it. I would also caution any of you who lost someone to a long-term illness or watched their loved one deteriorate physically, that this might be a hard one to read ever, but especially when you're fresh in your grieving. But it's deeply moving and gorgeous. So that is Our Wives Under the Sea. So those are all the books I wanted to share with you, the books I wanted to talk about that have helped me through various types of grief at different stages of grief and loss. And I hope that at least one of these will resonate with you if you pick them up and might help you a little bit as well. And like I said, I do have an intention to reread all of these in the coming months and years as a way to help me process the loss of my father. So I was going to say soon, but some of them I definitely am going to need more time. And that brings us to the books that I have added to my TBR to read, and these are books that I have not read before. So I'm not going to talk about each of these in depth because I haven't read them yet, so I don't have any real insight to how they handle grief or how they're written, but I do want to share them with you. So I'll put them up on the screen here. Some of these are nonfiction, some poetry collections, and then some fictional options as well. So I might not read every single one of these. I might not get to some of these for months or years or ever, but this is my growing list of books that are on my TBR specifically because they explore grief. And some of these are already on the way to me, or I already have a copy on my Kobo and will be starting as soon as I feel ready to. But like I said earlier, I am going to take my own advice, and I am trying to take it slow, be gentle with myself, be kind to myself, take breaks when I need to, let myself stop if I need to, because it's already a really hard time. And while I think and I hope that some of these books, that many of these books will help me, they also, could be counterproductive for what I'm trying to do and for my own mental health. So I'm taking it slow. I'm taking it one step at a time. It's really all you can do. And that is this video. I really hope this helps somebody. If you have more recommendations, please leave them in the comments, both for me, but also for anyone else watching this video. If you are watching this because you recently lost someone, I am so sorry for your loss. I know how that feels. I am in it with you. The worst pain I have ever felt in my entire life. This was a really hard video for me to make. I'm struggling right now, but it felt important for me to make it. Especially because my dad was such a big book lover. I think I need to wrap this up. I am getting really emotional. I'm really struggling. So thank you for watching. I hope this is helpful. If you are grieving, I am so sorry for your loss, and I promise you can get through this. I'm reminding myself of that, but I'm also telling you, you're not alone. Please lean on the people you have in your life. Reach out, get support from a therapist or a counselor or a grief support group if you need it. Rely on art, music, literature if it helps you, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.